Alright, so now let's talk about the second way of creating a controller. Now, as we all know that whenever we create a website or a web application or a software, we have to store the data somewhere in the database, and from where we can retrieve the data, we can edit it, we can delete it, and we can add more data into the database. And of course, all for performing or having all those things, we need to create the endpoints. For example, in order to show the data, we create a one function, let's say maybe list all data. In order to create a function, we have a in order to create a record, we have to have a function like create. For editing, like edit, and for deleting, obviously the delete function. Now, you might be wondering, why am I talking about these stuff right now? Because the second controller is exactly the boilerplate of CURD operations. So the CURD is a fancy term which means create, update, read, and delete. All right. So let's take a look how we can create the resource controller. By the way, the second controller would be a resource controller, and what boilerplate does that controller gives us out of the box. So let's head towards our project directory, and let's create a controller again. So php artisan make controller, and everything remains the same. I would also give it a name as maybe a user controller, or instead of user controller, let's also have a post controller, and we will give it a flag of resource. All right, and if I hit enter, the post controller is created. So I will double tap and search for post controller. Now when I open it, you will see like a bunch of functions given to us by the Laravel. So this is basically a boilerplate for us. So what it does is basically display a list of resources. It is containing the index function, the create function, the store function, show function, edit, update, and delete. All right, so we have almost 6 functions here. And by the way, so index will obviously list all the records from the database. Create will display the form from where we can create the function, and store will basically do all the process of the form. All right, whatever the data will be submitted from the form, it will automatically have to be listed here inside the store method. Then the show function is like, we really don't need that, but it's there for us just to let us know, like we can also use this function in order to just show some kind of post. For example, you can think about like single post, where you can display see all the contents, but you cannot edit it, you cannot delete it. Similarly, the edit function will contain the edit form, and also it will accept the ID of that post, relevant post. Then the update function will do the magic similarly to the store function, and it will do all the logics and it will store the data. And finally, the destroy function is used to delete the record. All right, so this is basically the functionality of the post here. Let's go ahead inside the database, inside our phpMyAdmin, and I will create a new database, and I will create a function or the migration to run to create that table for us. So click on login if you don't have any password, and I will create a new database. The name would be let's say basics. Okay, so the database is created. Now in order to create a table, we can create a table directly here. All right, but in Laravel we do not do in that way, but obviously we will talk about the migrations later on. We have not talked about those things yet. So what I will do is basically I will create the table manually by going by typing the table name in this database. So I will name it as simply posts, and I will create the ID and just the title, a description, and created at, and one more column for updated at. And I will set this to as auto increment primary. The title should be a varchar of maybe 255 characters. The description would be a long text, and obviously this could be null as well. So the created ad and updated ad would both be the timestamps, and by default we will choose the current timestamp, and for the updated ad in the attributes on update current timestamp we will set that. So every time we update a record, the updated timestamp will be updated. All right, so now we have posts here. All right, so quickly go into the .env. And by the way, inside the env, we can store the database credentials or passwords here. So where we have the DB connection MySQL, let this as it is, DB host, again, DB port, similar. Database, we have the basics, the username would be root, and the password will be empty for us. All right, so we have the basics here, database, just to be sure like I do not misspell those words. All right, so if I reload the page again, everything should be working. All right, so it does work. So now let's create a directory inside our views and name it as posts, and let's create 3 files here. The first file would be index.blade.php. The second file would be create.blade.php, and the last one would be update.blade.php. Okay, so first let's take a look at the create file, and I will just list the boilerplate here, and I will say create post, and obviously let's create a form with the method of post action. I will explain how we can do that, and obviously we need to have the separate div for and label, and let's say the title, and similarly input field for title, and input type would be text, and max length just set to 255 characters. ID would be title, and what else it's required, obviously, of course, and lastly the autofocus. All right, so by default the focus should be set to here. Now let's create this thing again, and I will set it to as description. Let's copy the description for this level 4, and instead of inputs, what we can do is basically we can create a text area and name that text area to description, ID description, and let's set the rows to 5, and that's it. All right, so now it's time to create basically the routes for this posts here. So let's go to the web.php, and inside here let's create so we have created a resource controller. One way of doing this was basically in normal functions or controllers, what we do is basically we define those by the help of get or posts. In resource, what we can do is basically route resource, right? Because we have created a resource route, the first parameter of that is basically the name from which you want to call the routes. I will set the name to as posts, and then the second one would be the controller. So I will point out to controller, post controller and class, like so. And now what we can do is basically we can copy this posts here, and let's go to the by the way, index.php. We had created this here, and let's define a new route here, and maybe let's call it as posts. And here, posts dot index. All right, now if I reload the page, all right, so what it says is basically like the post dot index is not defined. And the reason is that because we have basics here, we need to call it by basics.port. So what we can do is basically we can remove this from here and paste it down below all these things. And if you reload the page, everything works. All right. So if I click on that, you can see we are going to posts here. But how do we know like this post dot index? How are we actually getting that? Either we are assuming like this should be like index create store. Yes, this is the one way of assuming such stuff, but the second way is that we can also see the list of the routes that are available for us. So what we can do is basically we can go to the open the terminal, let's clear everything, and php artisan route list. If you do that, we will see a list of routes here. So what it does here, so let's take a look at these posts. All right, so all these routes here. So you can see like this post is accepting a get overhead method, and it is pointing to posts here. So posts dot index, and now it is pointing to post controller at the rate index method. Similarly, if we have any post method, basically on the if the form is submitted here, so this will be point out to posts dot store. We have similarly for post dot create and post forward slash post. So this is basically like displaying a single post. Yeah, so this is exactly doing what here. And we can also use the put and patch to in order to update the basically posts. The delete function is used to destroy the post. All right, so delete method. So in our form here, if you take a look at here, what we said was basically the method is set to post, but in order to delete it, we need to set the method delete. But by default, these functions, the HTML does not support delete. So we will see how we can actually tackle those things. And similarly for editing, we have the get and head method for edit, and it accepts the post forward slash the post ID or the post itself, and then the edit. All right. So so far what we have seen, like we can create a resource controller. So and we also have the posts create method here. So if I click on that, it goes to the post. Obviously by default this is an empty one here. Sorry, where we have this one here, we have empty here. And if I just copy paste everything here and just create an h1 for posts, we will see the posts displayed here. Obviously not yet because we have not returned any view. So let's return a view here, return view, and we are now inside the post directory and then the index here. Reload the page, we can see the posts here, correct? And obviously we can just change the name to all posts so that it reflects in our tab here. And if I try to go to the create here, we should see the form here. And how we can see the form? If we just return the view of create and remove everything, reload, and now we can see we have the form here. Although it's not really stylish and stuff like that, because this is really a simple form, but the main purpose of here is to learn things, not to basically dive into the styles. Obviously we will go into the styles when we will start working on our bigger projects. All right, so in the next lecture what we are going to do is basically we are going to see how we can store, take the data from here and store it in the database and then display all the data in the posts here. All right, so that's about it, and I will see you in the next video.